from wherever he is. And
At home. Good morning.
He said he's at home.
Morning, Mr. Brown.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mariano Browne. I see you still getting dressed.
Well, I mean, I'm fixing the tie. I have to look good when I come up.
I'm glad you have one, at least a tie.
Well, I want a little more than that.
Okay.
Thank goodness. Good morning, Captain Ron.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Good morning to you, Mariano.
Good morning.
What a week, Mr. Brown. What a week.
What are you?
You have been, I saw an article attributed to statements that you made to a newspaper this morning. You have been a senior public official and you were minister in the Ministry of Finance for many, many years. So you would have had, you've been accustomed to this process of audited national accounts being laid, sent to the Parliament and laid by the presiding officers. What is your opening response to this development in the country?
Well, first of all, I've not only been in those senior positions, I've been on the other side too. In my earlier life, in addition to being trained as an economist, I also qualified as an accountant. So I am a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Certified Accountants of the UK. And I was vice president of the Institute of Chartered Accountants for approximately 8 years. I never became president because I was literally resident in another country at the time, and it was impossible to hold the two positions, be president and be in another country. So I gave up the role eventually. So the bottom line is I have background. I'm a finance person, and I've been a finance person for most of my life. I've served as a financial controller. I've also served as an auditor. Now, the constitutional position of the Auditor General is set out in section 8, I think, of the Constitution, subsection 116, or section 116 and 117. 117, she's appointed by the president, so therefore she's independent. Subsection 116, subsection 6, right, says that she's not accountable and cannot be controlled by any party. Words to that effect. I'm paraphrasing. Right, section 116, subsection 1 says she's entitled to the books and records and everything which is required to allow her to come to an opinion. Right, the Audit and Exchequer Act sets out in section 24 the deadlines and the time frames by which financial statements must be presented from the ministry to the Auditor General so that she can express an opinion thereon. Right, and the deadline is January 31st. So she must have all the documents by January 31st, and she's required to give an opinion by April the 30th, which is in time for the mid-year review. All right, so in the circumstances, what her job is to give an opinion. The accounts are not hers, but she has to verify them. She has to say whether they're correct or not correct. It's a binary condition. All right, do they meet all the requirements? And the Constitution effectively makes her an independent person, And subsection 116 is very clear. Her job is not to take direction. She cannot take directions from anybody in terms of the exercise of her job. All right, so nobody could come and tell her what her job is or what she must do. All right, over time, the Auditor General's position, initially, the position was not occupied by qualified accountants. In more recent times, she has become, or the person who's appointed the position has tended to be a qualified accountant. And the staff in the department qualified accountants as well. In this particular instance, the person is reputed to have had private sector experience as an auditor as well. So it means that she comes to the job with the requirements for the office. So let's get that out of the way. All right. In these circumstances, the Ministry of Finance, the Treasury Division, must send across or must give all the documents required to justify an opinion or to give a clear opinion. And her job is to give an opinion. Her job isn't to give a good opinion. Her job is to give an opinion. And the opinion may be correct. The opinion, may be a good one. It may be a bad one. It may be a qualified opinion. In these circumstances, what we are dealing with is a situation where the numbers which were first remitted indicated a total revenue position of 61 point whatever billion dollars it was. And subsequently, it is said, and this is what is coming out from the conversation, I don't think there's any argument about that so far, right, that there was an error of approximately $3.4 billion. All right. It appears that the Auditor General has attempted to verify the difference and could not do so, and in these circumstances issued what is known as a qualified opinion. Right? Meaning that I've seen the numbers, but I can't verify this other part of it, as the case may be. I've not seen the report, so I don't know the full nature of the qualification. The reality is that she's entitled to an express opinion, and if she is not satisfied that the numbers are good, clear, and defendable in the circumstances, she's required to say so, right? Which is what has caused the problem. The difficulty is we've never been in this position before. Right? Generally, those accounts have generally been signed off without any sort of problem. I'm sure that there must have been situations in the past where there were areas in which the Auditor General may not have been happy, but subsequently information was provided to suggest or to diminish and or eradicate the person's reservations. In these circumstances, it seems that the information that has been provided was not sufficient as to remove those reservations. And in these circumstances, the Auditor General had expressed a qualified audit opinion and was not given a clean audit report, which of course is very embarrassing to the government. Right? So we have two letters, two pre-action protocols. And there's a constitutional problem here, right, where two independent bodies are at loggerheads. There is a leadership issue, right, which has to be addressed. The moral of the story is that the responsibility for preparing the numbers falls to staff who are under the control of or who report to a minister. So the minister is responsible in those circumstances. There's a management issue. The management issue is how do I manage the data, manage the information, and how do the managers or the specific day-to-day managers in those positions execute their job. And the leadership aspect is how do I address that issue and who takes responsibility for it.
Put a pause, Mariano, please. How material, in your opinion, are the circumstances in which the January 31st deadline, is it, for
Yes.
the Auditor General receiving the information according, and please correct me if I'm wrong, would have passed, which is after which the ministry officials sent this revised information about the supposed just over $3 billion understatement and the information in the public domain, which I can confirm or refute. The Minister of Finance gave an explanation last night that the Auditor General in the first instance refused to receive it because the deadline had passed, the statutory deadline had passed, and then subsequently received it, agreed to receive it and signed for it after a pre-action protocol was sent. And now today is the final day for the report to be sent to Parliament. It's already been sent. How material are those circumstances? And is the Auditor General required to, but I think it's probably a rhetorical question, receive even information that is significant, because $3 billion is significant, after the January 31st deadline?
All right. Well, first of all, 5% a materiality number of $3.5 billion, whatever the number is material. All right, amongst the 5% of the total amount, so it's not small. All right, and I mean, $3 billion. I mean, what was said last year was that we had a budget, so we had a surplus of $1 billion. So $3 billion could mean that we're in surplus or not in surplus, as the case may be. It also addresses the issue of the borrowing. What was the borrowing position? Whether the borrowing position was too high was high, or it was lower by 3.4 billion, 3.5 billion, So it does have a material impact, not only in terms of the report itself, but in terms of other knock-on variables, the debt to GDP ratio in particular. So that there are knock-on variables, and these matters are reported internationally to the IMF and so on, form part of international monetary statistics. And we do have a responsibility to provide good, valid, and clean data. All right. So it has implications to our responsibilities in a wider setting. So it's important, right? And the 5% number, that 5% variation is important too. All right. It's not small. Right now, the constitutional issue with respect to whether she should receive information after the 31st. Well, I mean, you have to be on the inside of the department, understand the details and so on. But the general rule, from what I understand from former attorneys general, with whom I've had conversations with about matters such as this on an ongoing basis in the past, is that a creature of statute has no maneuvering room where it's set out in the Constitution. You will recall the imbroglio with respect to the appointment, not to the appointment, but with regard to the report on the appointment of the commissioner of police. Did the president, I think, was put under was criticized because she has, her job is to receive the report and her job is to pass on the report. Her job is not to arrange for a meeting that could influence the report. And I think those were the circumstances. Now, similarly, in the position with respect to the Auditor General is under the Audit and Exchequer Act to receive all the data by January the 31st. Right? So, and I don't think there's any dispute that the information that was presented as of January 31st was incorrect, or alternatively, there was an error which materially affected those accounts, and something was presented subsequently. Now, is she, in these circumstances, what would have been required? Well, if the information was presented lately, one way she could have dealt with that or to deal with that is to include in the report that I received X amount at this date, and this other information came subsequently thereafter, which technically I'm not supposed to review, but I have done A, B, and C. Right? She could say that. Right? The issue seems to be not so much that the information is received late, but that the information was not verifiable. That's the problem.
Well, I asked the Minister of Finance yesterday if he can confirm or refute that documents to substantiate the position that this is a $3 billion understatement, Mr. Pleasant, and he said he didn't know. I hope I'm not misquoting him.
Well, I mean, if he didn't know in those circumstances, that's the leadership issue, and that's also the management issue. The leadership issue is about taking responsibility, right? The management issue is making certain I'm aware of all the details and the facts, right? Leadership is about doing the right things, and management is about getting things right.
But isn't he doing the right thing now, though? Because he said that information came to him from public servants who were embarrassed to bring it up, and the error was
immediately. Once we cross that bridge, what we have is we have a real problem now. It's not my fault; it's somebody else's fault, right? That sounds like Minister Hines. That sounds like Minister Dayal Singh, and we could keep going, right? Everybody is responsible, but not responsible. Right, so the idea is your staff. You're responsible for the operations of the staff. You're responsible to give them directions. And the bottom line, if an error was made, and boy, we make an error, but we didn't really want to tell you. Hang on, right? That's what constitutional responsibility is about. If there's an error, you have to say so. Right? You can't say it's the public servants, and I'm not sure. What's that? That can't happen. Right? That's one of the reasons why ministers have to take somebody has to take responsibility at some end of it, you know. Of course, staff make errors, but you have to. Here we are in this impasse. Right, the Auditor General is saying, "Hang on, right? There's a problem here with these numbers, right? And if you're coming to me to say X, Y, and Z, no, you have to verify. The law is the Constitution is very clear, right? Very clear. The Auditor General is entitled to see all books and records without fail, in order to enable her to express an opinion, right? So if you made an error, you can't tell me, boy, I make an error, you know, but it's all right, you know, everything okay now. Hang on, show me how the error was made. What did the error what caused the error? And if she's saying that you have been able to reconcile it and you can't come to a position, this is her position. This is her position, right? So the bottom line, somewhere along the line, there have to be some element of truth in it. The minister can't come now and say, well, I don't know. This is what the public servants tell me. He has to be in charge of all the facts. He's coming to Parliament. He coming to Parliament with half knowledge. What kind of thing is that?
Well, interestingly, and to me, you know, in a responsible sense, if documentation cannot be provided to substantiate the the proposed $3 billion increase in the country's position, wouldn't it be irresponsible for the Auditor General to add it to the books?
Precisely. She's put there and is meant to be independent. That's why it's set up that way. This is a check on the power of the executive and a check on the responsibilities of the executive. If she's she's just a rubber stamp, but what is she there for? She's not a rubber stamp. She's there to follow through with a very important constitutional responsibility, which is to exercise and verify that the ministers and the financial operations have done their job. And the act says very clear, she says court documents, any public officer, any department, right? That's what the Constitution says. So she has an absolute right to the information, not partial information, not some of the information, right? But enough information to allow her to come to a conclusion. And in fact, it says all the information, if I'm not mistaken, under section 116, subsection 1. Right? So she.
The state has now extended the time, which is what would have.
Well, the state has the capacity to vary the Audit and Exchequer Act, right? And it is vary the Audit and Exchequer Act in accordance with her circumstances, right? And the Audit and Exchequer Act says very clearly, right, that all the information must be presented by January 31st. Now, when we're doing an audit, now I speak as an auditor here, as having been in this position before, and I can say that I have run organizations which have received qualified audit reports. Right? But once I got a qualified audit report once, I get another one. I fix whatever I had to fix to make certain it didn't happen again. Right? And that's the position here. Right?
It's a qualified audit at this point.
It is a qualified audit at this point. It has to be. Right? And even if you adjust the law, that means to allow the information to be presented to her so she could consider it. The evidence would suggest, and certainly her pre-action protocol letter says that she did attempt to verify the information which was presented after the fact. Yet constitutional attorneys could deal with that. I'm not gonna make any statement. Let me just say that it is normal in verifying data that accountants, auditors look at what is called subsequent events. Were there subsequent events which were sufficiently material as to alter my opinion? In this particular instance, it is not a subsequent event. It was an error that occurred before the time frame that was not discovered. But what her letter says is that she was unable to verify the authenticity of the corrections. All right, so she said, you haven't presented me with enough evidence to say, look, this is right, and you can't reconcile it. That's what her letter says. And in those circumstances, right, she has to give a qualified report. She has to say, well, this is what I found, and this.
And at the end of the day, Mariano, is her signature signing off on that. So if she's not
Precisely
satisfied, it is her reputation on the line to have sign off on the proposed change or stick with her original position.
Correct. No, and here's the point, right? The constitutional responsibility and the constitutional architecture means that you are responsible for getting things done. So that's the ministry and the ministries and the departments. They are responsible for getting things done. My job is to make certain that what they're presenting is right, or what we call true and correct. Right? And there's another view, true and fair. So true and correct, true and fair, right? So I have to sign off and I have to make a statement to that effect, right? So that means you have to satisfy me. I have to be satisfied where the numbers are what you call it, are accurate. And in these circumstances, right, there is an error. I don't think anybody says that there wasn't an error. Even the minister declares that there is an error. He says, didn't he say that in Parliament yesterday? That there was an error?
Well, clearly there was an error. I don't know if I remember if he said it. But how material is also, and what's the possibility, Mariano, on, because there was a disaggregation of the figure from 2-point-something billion and 700 million or so that could not be accounted for.
780 million.
Right. How should and could the Auditor General disaggregate that if there was evidence provided to support the 2.x billion as opposed to the 780 million that maybe could not have been substantiated. Is that part of what a possibility is here?
All right. So from a technical point of view, there are 3 points that you're raising here. One, she could verify $61 million, $61 billion. And all the evidence suggests that she could verify $61 billion. The problem arises with regard to the additional 3.4. All right. The evidence, what the report says so far is that they were able to reconcile the 3.4. They know it is a 3.4 billion error. Well, I don't know exactly how you know it's a 3.4 billion error, but they could only verify 2.5 billion. All right. And they have another $800 million which they cannot reconcile. $780 million which they can't reconcile. Well, in those circumstances, the auditor could certify one that 61 point whatever billion was received, or alternately 61 plus 2.5 billion was received. She cannot certify that 64 billion, the full 64 billion was received because there's a problem. And I haven't seen any evidence. What her letter says, I didn't see enough evidence to satisfy the $3.4 billion either. That's what the letter says, right? So I attempted to do that. You said you reconcile it. Okay, fine, you reconcile it. But it is not, I am a doubt. The purpose of Auditor General is a doubting Thomas, right? That's the architecture, right? Her job is to certify that these things are right or are true and fair, are correct, right? So when you present the number to the public, I'm comfortable with the number, right? Well, it appears that the ministry is not even comfortable with what you call it, with the 64 billion.
But should we be surprised that this is the part that's confusing me?
What is confusing
from the ministry technical perspective, they say they've discovered this understatement, right? It's embarrassing for them. They went to the minister sought advice, and now you're presenting to the Auditor General, the constitutional creature, of this understatement with a hope that the original presentation be revised. Isn't it like basic or trite to make sure that the evidence to support that is also supplied to compel or to not compel? To invite the Auditor General to revise a position.
But the Ministry of Finance must know that they have to present documentation to verify stuff.
Well,
that's the point. That's why I said it's trite.
Yes. And by definition, since the act says she must be satisfied by the number, and her job is to verify it. And if she says to you, I am not comfortable with the numbers, what do? You have to qualify the report. It's very straightforward. All right. You have to qualify the report. I mean, you could qualify the report. She has the options are one. She can qualify the report for $800 million. All right. I have verified X, Y, and Z, subject to the fact that I'm not able to receive sufficient information to verify the sum of $780 million, which remains unreconciled outstanding. The evidence of which I have not been able to see. Or she could say the point, well, I could verify $61 billion, but I can't verify this other $3-point-something billion because I've not seen enough evidence to basically allow me to express an opinion on it. Right? I mean, the Auditor General has 3 positions. Right? I could certify 61 billion, but I can't certify the rest, right? Which is fairly straightforward. Or I could certify $63 billion if I had received the evidence, but I can't certify what you call it, the other $780 million. I mean, that's where she is. Now, the point is, in these circumstances, does she say that here's the point from the point of view of proof from an auditor's position. Hang on. You tell me you made an error, and this is error only affects you. How can I be certain that there were no other errors?
Yeah.
Right, that's
her job to verify that.
Yes, correct. So that's a very valid. So in these circumstances, there are issues, right? So the Auditor General, I mean, it is unprecedented. There are 2 things that are unprecedented. Well, not unprecedented. I can't say that's unprecedented because we have had the position of an Attorney General fighting with the DPP, right? So that's not what you call it. That's not unprecedented to have constitutional fights. All right, that has happened. And I'm sure that those things take place behind the scenes. I'm sure in the past that the Auditor General there may have been situations where there were numbers which were slightly off, and they have had to find a way to reconcile it and come to a conclusion. Right? Clearly, the fact that she was prepared in her letter, as her letter warrants, to assemble a team to do additional verification work on the 17th of April, 13 days before the conclusion of the report, for just to verify. All right, you say the errors are bringing a team. Let's just see exactly what takes place. Right? And the result would appear to be, on the basis of her letter, that she couldn't come to an opinion, that they weren't satisfied with the evidence that was given. Right? The Auditor General is meant to be a doubting Thomas and to be a skeptic. Right? That's why there's independence. Right? That's why there's separation of powers. Right? You are responsible for doing the work. You have to convince me that the work is adequate and accurate. And if I'm not convinced, then I'm not convinced.
Do you think the statement that, well, there was a new system and the tax revenue was just part of it, and we didn't reconcile or disaggregate X and Y is an acceptable position given what's at stake?
No, it's not acceptable. All right. Systems are changed all the times, and before we run systems live, we have to do testing. And the purpose of testing is to determine whether it behaves in the fashion in which it should. Now, when you are testing systems before you roll them out, all right, I could give an example. All right, changing the bank's accounting software and running the system in. Right, so we actually went live, and in the process, an error was discovered. $25,000 was the error. Right, $25,000 was also $25,000 in cash. Right now, in the going through the process, we did identify where the error was, and we did identify who the responsibility was. But it turns out one of the supervisors in the department had isolated the $25,000, put it in a bag, and put it separate. Well, with what intent? You didn't report it. Right. So what happened? You think happened immediately? She went home, and the other person was responsible. She got suspended one time. Right. Because it's not your money.
Are we saying that this entire imbroglio because a beta testing went bad?
Well, I don't know. I have no idea. Right. That is for the minister and the technicians, so basically to demonstrate how, why, when, and where. Right. And I make the point that you ought to have done enough testing before you went into a live environment, and the live environment is subject to controls. Right? The mere fact that this comes 90 days after the fact says that those controls weren't working very well.
But isn't this whole scenario, in a sense, indicative that the constitutional framework and that separation that you talk about works?
Well, I'm clear that it worked. I don't have any problem with the constitutional framework. All right. And it is also clear that there was an intelligent attempt to interpret the facts in accordance with the Constitution. Now, that's a matter for the constitutional attorneys to come to, because the constitutional attorneys, as I've said before, in my conversations with former attorney generals, one in particular, and I've had this conversation several times, all right, the position, he takes a position which is very clear. A creature of statute, i.e. somebody who is created in the Constitution and has to operate in accordance with the Constitution, has no discretionary power. This position is absolute. All right. Now, other people have followed that interpretation. Because you're a creature of absolute. If it says shall, you can't, well, not. That's it. You have to do it this way. This is the procedure that has to be followed. All right. And he's very clear on that. Now, in the circumstances, all right, here we are. The data has to be presented to me by the 31st. So whatever you present by the 31st is what you present by the 31st. Right? Now, how I treat with it subsequent to the fact immediately means discretionary authority. Does the Constitution give discretionary authority in those circumstances? Right? Now, I'm not going to give an opinion on that because I'm not a constitutional expert. I can't say. But I could say that clearly there was an attempt, an intelligent attempt to say, okay, good, there was an error, right? These are the numbers I've been presented with, but there's a material misstatement as a result of an error that will affect the numbers. Let me verify those numbers, which is what I don't think there's any argument that there was an attempt to verify the numbers, right? The argument is whether the Auditor General was sufficiently satisfied to come to a conclusion that allowed her to give a clean audit report, and the answer to that is no. And in those circumstances, she's entirely within her rights to issue a qualified audit opinion.
Mariano, what of the extension now? Even though there's an extension allowing the Auditor General's office to receive new information and also allowing the Auditor General past today, April 30th, to amend if she is so satisfied the report, I guess recall and amend. There's no obligation to change anything also.
Well, if they are changing the law in the Audit and Exchequer Act, they are changing the law in order to allow her to follow the procedure which they are now admitting to. In other words, that there was a delay, so we're changing the law to allow her to accept the new data, and we're changing the law so that it can be presented without breaching the law. No, that's what we call shifting the goalpost. Right?
Yeah, basically.
Right, they're shifting the goalpost because it says a material principle and material fact. Right? So is it mean that the goalpost is going to be shifted forever, or is this just done once? Well, it looks like it's going to be shifted forever. Right? And the part of the problem with these things is when, of course, you shift it, then other what you call it, material misstatements or other errors could crop up. Right? So here we are. The goalpost is being shifted because an error has taken place. So we're making the law based on an exception. They have problems with that too, by the way. So I leave the learned attorney on your panel to come to some conclusion where that is concerned. So we are shifting the goalpost because an exception has taken place, and in order to allow the Auditor General to live with the change in the law, so that if the law can now be changed so it meets the material circumstances of the change. All right. So there you go. All right. So okay, that's a practical solution. I can't argue with that. All right. It's a practical solution. All right. The real issue is that we ought to have done all the work that was required as a routine and as a standard. We've done it in the past. Right. If they had some little shifts and so on that had to take place, right, then you have to have some of the shift. But the shift here is not small. This is a material figure. This $3.5 billion. $3.5 billion is like a what you call it, a Hyatt.
Well, it's material, as you said earlier on, for several different reasons. It is financial and economic, but it's also political.
Material is there are a couple of things involved. It's material value, it's material principle. Right, it's a material principle, and that's what we're doing. We're making a change on the basis of we're making a change in principle, right? But the Auditor General has said, hang on, even if you change it, right, you still have to satisfy me. Right? I still have to be comfortable with these changes, right? And in these circumstances, consider now, right? So, all right, an error has occurred. I'm changing everything else to give validity to allow validity to the error. You still have to. I would feel those circumstances. You don't think you would feel very uncomfortable?
Well, especially given how it's played out in the public domain.
Well, all right. So you're going to be very uncomfortable. This is a very difficult situation. I don't know that there's anything with. I mean, I guess a political resolution is so that I could eventually end up saying, well, I met the requirements, right? And you get away. But the reality is that there's been enough churn as to raise issues of credibility, right? There are credibility issues here, and the credibility issues are not going to go away just like that.
Let's proffer two approaches here. One, the Auditor General is now allowed legally to accept and consider new information, and if she is so satisfied, change the report, and of course, the government will use that in the upcoming media review and all the international indices, including IMF, credit ratings, etc. Yada yada yada. But if the Auditor General is not so minded and is not satisfied, the report stays the same. Because that's possible too.
Yes, that's possible too.
And the media review is coming up. How much does this affect the media review? And can the minister, if that happens, if there's no change, legitimately reference this purported $3 billion change in position revenue-wise?
But here's the problem. Credibility is a matter of trust. I mean, so you could change things and you could say, look, we changed them. Right? The issue is, do I trust the numbers? One of the issues that crops up all the time in terms of the reporting and the comments which are made at government level with respect to the state of the economy is the following statement. Manufacturing grew by X% and manufacturing is likely to save us. Well, we have adjusted the standard we've adjusted our Trinidad and Tobago industrial classification to include the petrochemical sector as part of the sector. Mm-hmm. All right. So when the minister says manufacturing sector, all right, he's clearly referring to all of the manufacturing sector. But there are substantial weaknesses in a segment of that manufacturing sector. All right. So whenever he talks about positive developments on the manufacturing sector, it is dominated by the petrochemical sector, which, as we know, has between 40 to 50% of all the plants which are closed. Right now, that always gives me some degree of confusion, right? Because you're talking about growth and growth taking place and so on and a positive future, but we know that 40% of the plants are closed because we don't have enough gas, or we could talk about the strength of the manufacturing sector. So there's a trust issue with regard to the numbers, and this is one of the issues here, right? Because fundamentally, when we're doing plans or the business community is doing plans or international associations are doing plans, they are depending on the quality of financial data and the fact that nobody has interfered or manipulated them. That is what it is based on. All right? But here we are in a situation where we are accepting and saying that we've moved the goalposts to facilitate X, Y, and Z. Is this a one-off error? Right? Can we be comfortable that this won't happen again and the numbers are not going to be stressed? I mean, those are all fun. Those are issues which speak to the issue of probity and confidence.
Well, as we have you here, and you segue so nicely into the energy sector, and the U.S. pronouncement on the license issue and comments from Ministers Young and the Honorable Prime Minister regarding the American instruction for those who have interest in the Venezuelan oil sector to wrap up by X date. Mm-hmm. How much do you think this is going to affect us?
My position has always been very clear, and I'll repeat it. Right? From 2016, I was saying we didn't have a project. What changed in December was that we actually got a license. So we now have a license. But unfortunately, whether you will be able to monetize that license is dependent upon all the other permissions that are necessary. And when this OFAC exemption first came through, I was clear that 2 years is not sufficient. Yeah. Right? The evidence also suggests that Shell is of that opinion, because Shell, who owns 70% of that project, so in other words, that project is not going to go forward unless Shell says, I'm confident and I'm prepared to put my money in it. Shell has asked for an extension of the OFAC exemption for a 15-year period. Well, that tells me that Shell is not making a final investment decision until it receives an exemption for 15 years. No exemption for 15 years, no project.
But that's profound.
That's your interpretation, or is that a fact?
Well, you could take it anyhow you want. Right?
Is it your interpretation or is it a fact?
Well, I can't say it's a fact. What I know is a fact is that Shell has asked for an extension. Right? My interpretation is if it doesn't get the extension, it's not going to spend $1 billion US. I'm going to spend $1 billion US over 2 years, and I'm not going to.
They need to have sustainability guaranteed.
Correct. Well, what right thinking person is going to spend $1 billion if you don't know, if you're not certain that you're going to get what you're going to
But do you think we're exempt from that missive from the U.S. government recently?
Minister Young said it didn't apply.
Well, I don't know if Mr. Young is the U.S. government.
He said they've had favorable talks with persons on both sides of the political divide in the U.S.
Favorable talks with favorable talks with people on both sides is not inside of the OFAC office. You're spoken to political people who will bring a political position to bear at some point in time in the future. Right? The reality is we have the unknown of a November election coming up. Right? It could change. The change in political position could lead to a change in policy. Right? You could have any amount of talks. How are you getting past that?
Well, even without the potential political change, the U.S. has changed its position on Venezuela.
Well, twice it changed its position when it gave the exemption, and it's changing its position back now. So, right, I can't say with any degree of certainty what the position is going to be in October 25th of October 2025. I don't know. And in the circumstances where there is uncertainty, am I going to proceed to spend $1 billion? Would you, in those circumstances, right, assume that you're building a house, right, and you're building a house on which you're required to get a lease, but you haven't gotten the lease, right? Would you go ahead and build the house, or would you wait until
if I get a guarantee of a substantial lease?
Well, you're not guaranteed. You want to make certain you have the lease in your hand, not guarantee. A guarantee doesn't mean to say that it will come true. You want to make certain until you have the lease in your hand. Now, I'm saying that Shell is in that position. Shell is the one that's spending the money, It's spending 70% of whatever is required to be spent. And in those circumstances, if it is not satisfied as the investor that the funds are going to come through, it will not spend it. Full stop.
Yeah.